let's talk just for a second about your home of the last, how many years were you in Chicago?
About 20 years.
20
I
years.
moved there when I was 19.
19, yeah, I was thinking, so when I first encountered your work about 10 years or so ago, you were already kind of fully a part, at least in my vision of the, oh man, you had a vape too? This is awesome. Yeah. Pass back. That's okay. Of the Chicago scene, but you were born in California, right?
Yeah, I moved around a lot. I was raised by a single mother, so as you do, you chase jobs.
Right.
So I think by the time I was 18, we had moved 19 times. So, yeah.
Wow. Okay.
So I was both eager to choose a place for college, although I ended up dropping out of the Art Institute. That was a good distance from family, but also that I could stay for a while. And initially I went to go to the School of the Art Institute of Chicago,
right.
and it was simply because they offered me like the best scholarship, and it was like not within driving distance of family.
which is important.
Yeah, if you want to yell at me, you have to get on a plane.
Right.
Who would bother?
But and you stayed.
Yeah, Chicago is, and I think Columbus might have this too, where it's a good mix of culture, but it's not so expensive that artists tend to cannibalize each other. Like, people are very supportive within comics, within music. People collaborate because this is not a knock to New York or San Francisco. If you have to make $3,000 in rent, maybe you're not trying to build a community and help other people.
Right.
Maybe you're trying to get enough rent. And I'm sure Columbus has this too, where there's a lot of culture, but there's a lot of community and cooperation, and Chicago is really great for that.
And not that sense that one gets in cities like New York that it's
I think
everybody
it's
for
just
themselves.
cost of living. Yeah, I think that it really, and I wonder what's going to happen with, like, this is happening a bit to Oakland.
Right.
And you need art spaces where people can go to school, experience culture, like museums, and have bookstores, but also that they can afford to live the artistic lifestyle, which is you have no money.
Right.
And you need cheap rent, and you need...
And you need people with couches that crash on.
Yeah, and it's so...
And Chicago was that place for it, so...
Yeah, Chicago is very affordable, and people are really uniquely welcoming. Like,
Yeah.
if you say you want to get... if you just start drawing a comic, people, if you're not a dick, they're going to try to encourage you
Right.
and fold you into it.
That is the Midwestern rule.
Yeah.
If you're not a dick, you're in.
Yeah.
And I like that.
In trying to explain certain things about America to JC, I like, we're welcoming, but also we have this rule that the most violation is you can't be the person who acts like you're better than someone. We
Right.
don't like you think you're better than me, so if you act cool and you're nice, this will be returned to you.
Yes. And
That's kind of our rule.
yeah, and in certain cities you learn how to make other people say you're the best at things. But
you can't go around announcing. No,
you can't do it
not in
yourself.
the Midwest. No.
No,
When people do that, people just silently sip their beer and think like, asshole.
Yeah, and then share that news with yeah, absolutely. And it was, I mean, it's for those of us in, let's call it the exurbs of the Midwest. There was always a sense that Chicago had this kind of thriving comics scene, this comics community. But I realized as I've gotten to know folks from Chicago more, it actually was a lot of different, smaller communities, not one monolithic community.
Yeah, there's different generations, and there's a unique pressure that, like, we have a history of newspaper comics that were made in Chicago, and then I still claim Dan Klaus, even though he moved out of the city, and
Sure.
Chris Ware and Ivy Brunetti and Jay Stevens for a while lived in Chicago. So I'm forgetting his name, but I think he worked on Yellow Dog. So we've had generations of cartoonists from different generations. So it's kind of enticing yet intimidating. Like pages from Jimmy Corrigan were serialized in the free weekly newspaper I picked up. So I was both eager to become a cartoonist and terrified because the level was so high. And it just like came out every week, like, here you go, be this good.
Here's
and there's
free,
Arthur Pruitt too,
yeah.
and I was a huge Softboy fan, so Chicago has a lot of...
Yeah, and you're right, and I forget about the importance of Chicago to the underground. I mean, that's, you know, Jay Lynch and Skip were there before they went up to San Francisco. Now it's absolutely right, it goes all the way, and then the newspaper cartooning.
So there's like a continuity, and I was really like, it was weird when I was leaving, because I was like, I'm proud to have made comics in Chicago.
Yeah.
There are like lots of different groups, and now as comics has become more something that's taught in colleges, it's really interesting because there's newer and newer groups, but there is a sense of community. Like people, our great independent comic shop, Quimby's, it's always been the center kind of the little comics community there. And everyone, as I'm sure is true in Columbus, in the Midwest, everyone knows each other.
Right.
So,
and part of going there to pick up comics is also to go there and see people and say hi.
Yeah, you just
kind of come out of your shell.
Yeah.
Or your beautiful. I mean, this is always to me the ideal vision of what a cartoonist studio should look like.
Oh, this was I miss this because I'm still setting up, but I have a lot of Thomas Nast is a huge inspiration for me, so I have a lot of Harper's, and the drawing up there, my friend's son did that of my dog Walter, and it's both terrifying and really great.
I love it. This guy's a future underground cartoonist. We're going to bring him back there. Walter appears regularly in your work, and because he's amazing. A lot of us are huge Walter fans who've never met Walter, myself included. And one of the things that comes through here, and when you talk about your work, is your interest in that history. It seems like you're interested in comics history and print ephemera, you're interested in old humor magazines, and so that's been kind of part of your work. A lot of cartoonists come to that, after maybe 10 years or so of cartooning, but it seems like that's always been an interest of yours from early on, thinking about genealogies and continuities.
I have this, I've tried to understand it in the same way, I'm really drawn to certain periods, late 1800s print things, and part of it is because it's the birth of popular culture, and it's so interesting to, like the old ads where they're like, you cannot miss it, buy this product.
Right.
It's in the clumsiness of what we know now, but I think I have an interest in history because both my parents are orphans, and we do not have any history. And so even in middle school, I was deeply into Civil War history, and I think drawing maps and lineages and trying to fit myself into that has always been interesting because we don't have any history.
And that's really fascinating to me, that interest in kind of older print culture. And here we're not talking antique print culture, but in terms of popular mass media, the kind of beginning of it.
It's the start of it, and it's really for me, I collect a lot of older music, and part of the interesting thing about it is the variety of even just the singing styles, because this was before radio and other things normalized. This is how a beautiful voice sounds.
Should sound, right.
And so the
people
variety,
just had the sheet music.
And the same as comics. Comics were a very popular thing, but if you go to the Billie Ireland, you can see tremendous variety of this now very popular thing we have as it was forming itself into this popular medium. And it's really interesting to see because we're saturated in pop culture.
There were no rules back then when they were starting out. They were just
they were kings.
And that's the kind of, that's part of what I love about the world of comics, in which, of which you are such an important part today, is that somehow you guys have found a way to keep that energy of comics going, despite the history that then follows that first generation of cartoonists of industrialization and standardization. The world that's come out of, over the last couple of generations, out of the underground movement, alternative indie comics, you guys have really found ways to keep reinventing the possibilities of comics. I see it in looking at your own work. You're always trying new things, experimenting with new things, even as you're interested in connections and genealogies to the past. And I know one of the things, I'm amazed at how much I just from looking at a couple of interviews, you're very clear about I even think I remember the name of your favorite pen nib.
Oh yeah. But for me, I really like cross-hatching, and as I can I've tried to figure out why I liked it, because Early on, I always drew as a kid, and I had Alice in Wonderland and John Tenniel's illustrations. When you're a kid with a pen, you look at it and you're like, what even is this? Like, how is this drawn?
So you reverse engineer?
And yeah, and you get really interested, and for a while I would do it with these cheap Pentel V5s, and then just you do your research and it's like, okay, it's a nib pen,
right.
And then you realize like, okay, they used older things, and trying to find the right tool for it, and a lot of the older nibs, there's more variety,
Yep.
And the ones being manufactured now, because no one really uses these. It's hard to find really good ones. The standard hunt ones that most people use, I'm heavy-handed and I snap them. So I use, I just buy a bunch of vintage things, and I have a like affinity for old things. So
the Lady Falcon, is that what you use?
Lady Falcon, and that's the one I found works for me, and it's annoying because I have this finite supply, and that's going to be a problem.
when they go, do you have a search open on eBay looking for it?
I do, and I have a relationship with some calligraphy shops where I told them, like, I wrote down, like, if you ever get these in stock, I will buy them, and then I save all the old ones, I soak them in pen cleaner, and then I scrub them down individually with toothbrushes, and they're in a, like, these are my nibs, these are my B nibs. Yeah, because there's not an infinite amount of it,
right.
And I'm hooked on it, so.
And I know you've done digital work, you work with a lot of materials, but you keep coming back to these that have worked for you, that give you that kind of Nast feel or that Wizard of Oz feel from your childhood. And that's something I find kind of fascinating, that ability to kind of balance the desire to always be experimenting and reinventing while always remaining connected to the traditions that you want to find ways to continue, even as they're becoming extinct in a number of ways because of the media. One of the things I want to make sure that we don't run out of time before we get to a couple of related issues, your work from the beginning has been very committed to autobiographical storytelling. I mean, almost from the earliest I can think of seeing your work. And you've been incredibly generous and honest and open in this work, also hysterically funny, even with some of the saddest and most painful pieces. What draws you to autobiographical comics? How do you find a way to live a life and share a life simultaneously?
There's a tension, but for me it's really, I think maybe this comes from drawing a lot as a kid in the same way you're drawing as alive and you go vroom, vroom. I think I drew so much as a kid that essentially I needed as like, you know how cows have multiple stomachs? I feel like drawing autobiographical things is this extra stomach to understand what is actually happening to me. And I used to make them for myself and share them with a few friends, and it's an interesting tension because sometimes I find it's best if I feel almost uncomfortable, like maybe that was more than I wanted to share, but it's a good zone. And it's also, I think, one of the great things about comics and self-publishing, or there's mass media and then there's independent media.
Right.
And by making something, not only do you get to make a version of yourself, you add to the diversity of and for me personally, like I relate and connect to a lot of characters, but maybe it's narcissism, like I have my character that I connect to, and it's pleasing if other people are like, I felt the same too, and it's a way to sort of virally inject yourself into like the options of types of characters.
Awesome. I love the analogy of the stomach too as a place to digest.
A lot of times I don't understand what's happening because there's something like I always think like there's something about making comics where you overthink it, but somewhere in your gut, instinctually, you do know the right way to make things. So the best time is when you just sort of like go through it and you're not sure, and then it becomes automatic and you find your flow, and then now you've processed an event in your life.
That's terrific. I love that. And you had obviously a community in Chicago, but you also, when I first discovered your work, I also encountered your work in part as kind of part of a larger community that seemed to be kind of out there of people around your age, who were kind of diving into autobiographical comics, and I think I'll come back to that in a second. Yeah, I think here's a couple early stuff you did with and about your time hanging out with Julia Wertz, and I think, is that Sarah Glidden up there?
Yeah, this is the first time we went to a comic convention, me and Julia. Julia started around the same time I did, and as we were both, we weren't making, and this is not a knock, but we weren't making cute comics.
Right.
We were kind of like hot messes of people.
And sharing that.
Yeah, and so like we bonded over that, and this is the first time we went to Mocha. Sarah Glidden hosted us, and it was a complete shit show. And at some point, like, we decided we wanted to get tattoos, and we couldn't find anywhere. And so Sarah found us, she was looking for us, and we were eating Chinese food in an alley. and she was kind about it, like, okay, like, but I think maybe she was thinking, like, why did I agree to be responsible? This is like at our top, like, as socially awkward people, we also drank a lot, so this probably fueled it. But, and for us, this is one of our earliest conventions, so we were just like, okay, you have to talk to people, glug, glug, glug.
Right. Yeah.
But it was a funny moment because this is also the first time we've met Sarah in person, and for me and Julia, sometimes we end up in situations where we're garbage people, like, what's wrong with us? And she found us at this moment, and just trying to explain, like, oh, well, we were trying to find an illegal tattoo parlor we heard about, but we didn't. So we got like these noodles, and we're just going to sit in the alley and eat them.
And I love this collaborative one you did below. It's just the punchline of a longer piece, where she's coming up to visit you, and it takes forever on the train. And you meanwhile drunk up all the cab money. You say that's just
it was like we had a lot of fun time in her earlier visits. She's sober now, but like at first it was just like, I don't know, we both started out at the same time. We had the same vibe, and she's very tiny, so as a joke, we had a tradition where she'd come to Thanksgiving at my place, but one year I made all the food tiny, because this is the funny joke for her, to be like, here's a pie your size for your little hands. But she's very small.
Yeah, no, I've met her. As a vertically challenged person, I enjoy talking to her. And any chance I get to talk to somebody shorter than me is awesome. And it was part of what I really loved about your work when you were starting out is that sense of both I think calling it shamelessness seems the wrong thing, but just like refusal to be ashamed of all the things that you hadn't figured out yet, all the mess.
I'm gonna do this, I'm sorry, I don't want to call
please. And that openness about those issues, even though I was, when I first encountered your stuff, a good deal older than you were, it was so refreshing. It's like, oh, she is so much more mature than me. She's already figured this stuff out that I've been trying to hide. And I think, this is part of what you're describing. For a lot of autobiographical cartoonists, there must be that feeling of like, people are connecting to your work, not because they necessarily had the same experience, but because it helps, give them, a surrogate stomach, as it were, to work through social anxiety, for example, or issues with compulsion, or whatever is being explored, and maybe indirectly. You must get at shows like Mocha and so on, and you have here's a nice comic you did of the scene at Mocha. It requires a lot of sociality. I just came from SPX last weekend, and
it's a very awkward thing to make cartoonists do. It's an awkward. I think
the one piece seems cruel.
It's both magical to be able. I think there's a part of the reason I think comics has become more and more popular and vital is that even when they're mass-produced in books and professionally published, it's a very handmade item, and it's very intimate. And you do not have a lot of that in this world, and I think there's an intimacy that people immediately recognize, but it's,
and are craving, I think.
But it's a very awkward format to usually at comic conventions and at Cartoon Crossroads, I'll be doing little drawings because I think it's weird to stare at someone as they decide if they want your thing or not. And I know some people are conflicted and they think you should, and also. To be honest, my books are not, my comics are not expensive, and for that price, I don't want to answer the question when someone goes, what's this about?
It's just like, take a chance or not.
Yeah, like it's like $5. Like I don't know, it's
about $5.
Yeah, like there's the answer.
Yeah.
So I always do a little drawing because I find it awkward, but then at the same point, I love that you can buy these handmade things from the person directly, but it's weird. It's a tension.
It is, and you can feel the tension in these rooms on both sides. There's so much excitement to be there.
I just hand out Xanax and like
I wish there was a
promoted to
Xanax
everyone who
dispenser.
just is like, all cartoonists have anxiety disorders and also a high amount of like IBS and Crohn's, so I always have like, I got Xanax, I got Imodium, who needs these?
Well, I can imagine that at Mocha, your pharmacy out front must be awesome.
Yeah, no,
I'm only going to go to conventions that you're at.
I'm very sympathetic to anxiety and the way it manifests in the body, so I'm like, I can help you. Here you go.
Walking through SPX this past weekend, literally people clearly saw me as a mark, though. They'd be like, hey you, I got a comic about fear of flying. You're like, oh yes. And it's like, I must have just been conveying anxiety. So, I
feel like that's like the technique people use to advertise stripper shows.
Exactly.
Hey, pervert, want to see some tits?
I'm just saying, I came up with a lot of comics about anxieties I didn't know I had until I read them. Now I have them all. But it always, you also have to do a lot of hustling, right? I mean, one of the
I
things.
refuse to hustle.
You don't do any of that?
I don't, like, I think the thing I think that about the kind of comics and a lot of art, do not fold in things you hate into the job.
Right.
Like, I have friends who hate social media, and they wonder, if I don't do Twitter, will I not get jobs? If it causes you so much distress, don't do it. For me, when I table, I know that maybe I could sell more if I hustled, but I'm not comfortable with it.
Right.
So I'll do drawings, and I like to have some interactions, but it's not totally comfortable for me, so I'm not going to force that to be part of the job.
And you've arrived at a place, and actually from pretty early on, where you've found ways of making some income with art independent of your personal work.
Yeah, I do. There's really very few people who can make a living from comics. It's just not that sort of thing. It takes so much time, and sometimes it's for small audiences, and it doesn't make it less valid, but just practically, it's very hard. People have been doing Patreons lately.
Right.
I think I'm saying that right? Don't know.
Yeah.
I think that's working, but the amount of hustle you would have to do to try to make it, like John Porcellino, hustles like crazy, goes to every show, and I know that's not within me, and I'm lucky to do illustration work, and so that's really where maybe in my lifetime I've made 2 months rent from my comics, but I work as an illustrator. A lot of people I know teach or do something kind of arts adjacent, but and it's weird to think about how much, I love comics so much, and to think about all the missing, the Hicksville library of books that don't exist, because someone had to make sandwiches at their job and couldn't do it.
Yeah.
It's pretty sad.
It is. And I think, there are maybe more arts adjacent opportunities than there used to be. Of course, there's also, it's a crowded marketplace as well of very talented people. But, at this, you've also, I think I saw in Publishers Weekly, you have a new book project coming up in 2020. So, and, you have a long track record now in that industry. So you're kind of able to have these two professional identities.
Yeah, I'm really lucky because, as I said, I dropped out of the Art Institute, which is strange because I've gone there to advise students, and I'm like,
drop out.
Guys, I left here because I knew I couldn't afford this amount of debt with what I wanted to do. So that's my first advice.
And it still invites you back.
Yeah, and it's a bit like, oh, I'm going to walk in here with a bit of a strut. It's just like getting away with something. But it's hard to piece together a living that doesn't take up all your time. But I can't teach because I don't have a BFA. I did a workshop recently and I really enjoyed it. But honestly, teaching is its own really fully immersive thing, and I'm selfish. I'm like, I don't want to own a classroom full of students. All my friends who teach, the mental breakdowns their students are having, as you would at that age, are their problem, and I don't want that.
So you don't want mine.
No, and I love that they're like, oh, so-and-so is having a huge problem. I'm like, your job is horrible.
Yeah.
Like, I just have to meet my deadline and send sketches.
I love that. Yeah, no, it has its own drama that can be all-consuming. And I'm going to bounce you around a little bit in terms of chronology, just because I want to make sure we get to touch on a few things. But I've been obsessed with this image. I think I saw it first in this issue. And it's obviously, for those who don't, some of you guys recognize the allusion right away, but it's an allusion to image by Justin Green's Pinky Brown.
It's actually not.
It's not?
No, it's, and there was actually just a problem where Justin was very angry and thought it was an illusion. Mine was actually related to, I collect a lot of images of old magic posters and escape artists. So it's actually
an escape artist.
The idea is that it's an escape artist thing, and I'm really very sorry, but Justin is very mad about this.
How can you be mad? It's awesome. If it was an illusion, it would be a great one.
I think,
I'll take that off the screen.
No, it comes from a similar place, the idea of struggle, but for me, it was more...
That would explain the difference.
It's less about, maybe, here's the suffering I do to make you this thing, and more watch with similar ease how I... one hand behind my back.
Actually, I love this, because I was going to ask you about, aside
from... I collect a lot of magic posters because they're fascinating to me.
And it is a magic trick. You are, unlike, let's say, in the Binky Brown image from '72, you're suspending yourself. It's magic, right? You're levitating yourself, trussed up and bound up, and drawing with your mouth, which is just a beautiful figure for, the work of the autobiographical cartoonist, partly, as you said, kind of to, the act of cartooning is a magic act itself, is part of why we gather around to watch
And autobiography is both it's an endurance thing, but it's also a performance. You are telling your personal story, but you are crafting it in comics, which is a communication language, to share with people. So. And
this kind of the fantasy that perhaps out of all of this magic will come some liberation, but then of course the magic trick would also be over. So that's fascinating. I'm glad I asked, even though I'm very sad. I respect Justin. He's a huge influence, but it really wasn't related to that image, and unfortunately he's really angry about it. And the best I can do is explain that mine came from a totally different place. A different genealogy, and a genealogy that traces its source back in many ways to that place we were talking about of kind of print ephemera. And
early magic posters are really fun. There's ones by Keller I like because they're really eerie, but there's also a lot where the devil is literally showing someone a book, here's how to do magic.
Right.
And it's interesting because they're very beautiful, but in a weird way they're very clunky with the image, because we're so slick now, and they're so on the nose about things. So I collect a lot of magic posters and a lot of stories. There are these great ones, it's just a head with a turban. It says "Ask Alexander."
Yeah.
But and he's wearing a turban, and then they write Bombay in the corner. But that magician, he was trying to pretend that he was from India. He's Jewish. He's American. But he would just never speak during his performances, and he would wear a turban because this is obviously the fortune-telling Orient. And then they would put fake marks as if the posters came from India in it. So any Alexander ones, I collect reprints because the originals are very expensive, but graphically they're amazing. And I think actually I also collect histories of con artists, and he's actually I think related to Sophie Smith, who was one of the original con artists in the Klondike Gold because when there were gold rushes, what would happen is prostitutes would come in and con men would come in.
Yep. Those were the only people the people running the cons and the people running the houses of ill repute were the only ones who made any money in those gold rushes.
Yeah, and the stories about it, it's weird because it's crime, but I love the stories about it because there's such theater to it. And so I love that the whole, I don't know, I love like low history, I guess.
You should totally write, I mean, when you're ready for an autobiographical break, write a history of Alexander.
I would. He has an autobiography, Joseph the Yellow Kid Weil, and
Right.
he was named, he didn't even like the comic, he always wore yellow, so that's how he got the nickname. And he's one of the great con artists. The movie The Sting is basically based on things he actually did. And recently I completed a long Chicago goal. I knew he was buried in Chicago, and I've been looking for his grave because I wanted to lay yellow flowers on it. And finally, the internet made it happen, because I used to be in touch with the Chicago Historical Society, and I said, like, he was Jewish, he might be in a Jewish cemetery, he died this year, and they were like, we can't help you, we don't know where this is, but now there's findagrave.com, so I just Googled it, and I found it.
And fellow obsessives who are looking for this grave for their own personal reasons.
So I completed, this was like a 10-year quest to do
great.
this, so thanks, Internet.
That's fabulous. I want to talk about this remarkable comic that you began self-publishing. When did the first one come out? This is Do Not Disturb My Waking Dream.
I'm really bad about my own chronology.
I'm going to say around 2006, 2007, around that period.
Possibly.
That's
Probably. Yeah.
I think that's right.
Yeah,
Let's
I think that's
let's go with it. And you started self-publishing it, and then there was somebody before you started working with Uncivilized Books.
Well, they were for sale briefly through Asthmatic Cave Records, because I was doing
You started.
artwork for them.
Right.
They weren't publishing it, but they're very kind. They're a small
That's
record
right.
label.
Yeah.
And they
With
offered...
an awesome name.
Yeah, and they offered to sell them, and I told them, I don't think we have the same audience, but go for it. And it was a very strange thing, because I was technically, a friend said, like, why are you on a record label? I'm like, because they're kind and strange.
Yeah.
Like, I don't make music, they're just selling my mini comics. So briefly they were available.
You don't make music, although you write about, music plays a role in a lot of your comics.
Oh, you have to have something while you're working.
Yeah. And you write some really kind of lovely comics about, the music of daily life, the sounds of getting the cat or dog to come into bed with you, or songs that have meant a lot to you. The kind of, I think there is a connection there between music and comics.
Yeah, I think, and I don't know if it's interesting to figure out, like, the Cartoonist as a sort of, like, collection of obsessions. Like, most are collectors, most like history, most have a genre of music they're very dedicated to.
Sometimes obsessively.
Yeah, and I don't know if it's just the overall, like, kind of obsessive nerd thing that just, maybe that's kind of it, but it's...
Or they find something that gives them the mood and the rhythm they need for their work.
Yeah, and it's strange to me if I meet a cartoonist who doesn't collect something, because for me, how you get into comics is you're a kid who reads comics, and then you collect them. And at Pisker, who I think you probably know, we talked a lot about, like, the long boxes and the quest to, like, the idea of going to comic conventions back when you were a kid is because that's where all the back issues were.
Right.
And you only had access to what you could get to on a bus at your local comic shop. So maybe you could go to the big comic convention and go through all the ones and find all the back issues.
And fill in the gaps.
Yeah, it wasn't like...
Make everything suddenly make sense.
Yeah. Find out, like, and get mad and be like, that's a stupid storyline.
Well, when you talk about your collection of things like magic posters and so on, and you can think about almost every cartoonist who is kind of part of your world. They all, as you said, almost all have some little obsession.
Yeah,
some of them share them. Record collecting can be a common one, postcards and so on. And part of it's also about arranging and curating the collection too.
Maybe that's it. It's like a weird magpie instinct, but it's strange because now, having met more French cartoonists, it's strange to see, like, oh, this is an international weird personality disorder. It's I don't know. It's an interesting thing to puzzle. I think I was talking about with Ed about, like, there's an interesting now, like, you're older, so you remember a lot of the things that are popular movies now are fantasy and superhero. These were like get punched at lunch stuff when I was growing up. This was deep nerd stuff. like, you know, the kid wanted to talk about, like, actually the sword in the Lord of the Rings, this was like, yeah.
You saved that for a safe
and
space.
it's pop culture now, and I don't know if it's because the original superheroes kind of came out of post-war anxiety, and I wonder if, like, post-terror anxiety has somehow led to this, like, mass superhero, because all of this stuff, like, it's great seeing it, but this really used to be the stuff people would, like, lie about, like, they would bring, like, a cool, like, Fangoria magazine and hide their nerdy stuff inside,
right,
because it was persecution. Yeah. And it's strange to see how, it's cool to see how mainstream it is, but it's just wondering, like, why the surge?
And
I think it's terrorism.
It's certainly got to be, in terms of superhero stuff, a big part of it. But
everyone knows about Spider-Man now. This used to be a really nerdy thing to be like,
right,
you couldn't ask boys, like, if Spider-Man's real name, no one would know, and everyone knows.
You know, when I teach a comics history class, 90% of the students there never read comics, but they know everything.
Yeah, it's really...
Because they're encountering it through other media.
Yeah.
I mean, it's, you know, in some ways it's kind of great because it's surrendered comics now as a space that can be much more diverse in terms of the kinds of stories it tells, in terms of the kinds of voices it includes, although there's always people who are going to be pushing back against that.
They can go crack. Like, I don't, I was so not involved because, like, I don't have a deep love of the Ghostbusters franchise, but it seemed like a really weird thing to get so mad about.
Yeah.
And it's just like, you inhabit a fragile world if this is, like, a big problem to you.
Yeah.
You're legitimately angry over this.
Or if you even thought that was a good movie in the first place, that's worth defending.
Yeah, no, it's a weird thing. Like, I didn't realize that this was your classic, like, this was your deep epic classic, but
I mean,
but having movies and more character, it's interesting. There are far more women in comics, and I know, I don't follow superheroes so much, but I know they've been trying to make more diverse characters.
They have been, with a lot of pushback, my sense is. But because there is that rabid fandom that, let's just say, feels empowered at the moment. But I think, you know, I think it's, you know, they're going to lose and comics are going to win.
Yeah, it's like, haven't you learned that from comics? Like, it's like the people who are shouting against, like, we learned this from our superhero comics.
You would think, you're really misreading these things.
Yeah.
So, are you still working on the larger book?
Yeah, I'm working on a collection of my comics with Drawn and Quarterly. And I'm working on 2 longer stories to start and end the book that are really more, a bit straight memoir, but also a bit more abstract than that. And it's not going to be completist.
Right, no, of course.
But hopefully it will be very coherent. And
that's exciting. And maybe,
I'm very excited.
And maybe we can collect the rest of this stuff into other places, because so many of these, one of the sad things about minis is they go out of print.
Yeah.
And they're, you know, they get, when people discover, it's a little like the old days of TV, when you discover a show before DVD and VHS, you're out of luck.
And then you can track the, I know, like, I recently had to pack up all my stuff, and then looking at it, even the mini comics I don't like, it's a time capsule of this period in comics, and
a period where you were. It's a personal story.
It's really interesting to just, so I have to keep them all.
Yeah, no, it's one of the things that I don't know if this will be part of this collection or maybe something down the road. You've been incredibly honest and in a way that's been really important for me following your work about your struggles with health issues, including thyroid cancer, back surgery. Most recently, I think you had to have tear duct surgery. Is that correct?
Yeah, and it didn't work, and it's interesting because so JC is French, and he's like, so you don't have to pay for it. And it's like, no, that's not how. It's not like.
No money back.
Yeah, he was just like, come on, it didn't work, get your money back. Like, no, that's not a thing here. But
it's a nice thought.
It's a nice idea that you're just like, I'm still unhealthy, but yeah, no. It was a weird thing. I have a weird relation to my body that I've never felt connected to it, and then as it started disintegrating around me, it's really strange. And again, as making comics is my way of processing, it's the way to get through the very, as I'm sure you know, it's a weird experience being sick, and it's also, the thing that was strange to me is when I first found out I had cancer, all I could think about were all the cancer movies I saw, and then thinking like, oh man,
those are not good models for what's
no, because I just thought like I'm not a super positive type who's going to learn how to do yoga and change my life and
now I'm going to start living.
Yeah, and so I'm like, oh, I'm going to die. Like it's just I'm not like I looked up blogs and there's this one woman. She's like, yeah, I teach yoga in Costa Rica now, and I just thought like I'm fucked.
Delete.
Yeah, like I need to like if I'm not cheery enough to get better or positive enough, like, and there is like a correlation where sometimes people think like, if you're negative about it, it's like people still think like, oh, she had so much worries, she gave herself cancer. And it's just really like...
Susan Sontag wrote about that 40 years ago, and it's still true.
And
it's still in this culture.
So it was interesting for me to make comics because I found that there's not a lot of comics or writing that I found that I could relate to the experience, and because comics is sort of like DIY, I'm like, oh, okay, I'll just make it about it. But it's strange because it's not a compact narrative, and I'd like to go back and revisit, and I'm sure you know from being ill, part of the weird thing is the way it doesn't fit your expectations of narrative.
At all.
There's so much dead time.
Right. I mean, one of the things that happens is time just goes weird.
Yeah, and you're just bored, and your body doesn't work.
It's either time is going like way too fast, and you're careening towards something terrifying, or it stretches out.
Yeah, and it's weird because I don't know why. Like for me, like I all I could think about were like the movies and stuff, and I'm like, oh. So then you have the thing where I puke into the toilet, and then I brush my hair, and a thing comes out. And then, you know...
And you stare into space.
Yeah, I look at people, and then I rebound, or they just remember me.
And of course you have to look much better as your hair's falling out.
Yeah, but like kind of sorrowful.
Right.
Yeah, a little poetic. And I just thought, like, I don't fit this narrative, I'm gonna die.
Right, and instead you capture what it's really like, which is, you know, that, right?
Yeah.
You're staring at your feet, and...
It's boring, it's people measuring how much you've pissed.
Right, intake, outtake.
Yeah, and asking you, like, did you move your bowels today? Like, and it's like, I hope to. Like,
and I love that strip you did up on the top about how our attitudes towards all of this can change so completely. You captured that. You know, 3 months ago, 4 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, one cat stand ago, and the kind of, you know, by the end you're like, yeah, sure, just take it all out.
Yeah, no, it's like, it's weird. You become really pliable, and I don't know about your experiences, but for me, the hard part is when you're in the wait and see periods, because when you're being attended to, you're like, that's right, let's go fix me. But then you have these periods, like after my last scan, they're like, I'm like, what? And this is after months of going to the doctor every week. They were just like, okay, see you. And I'm like, when? And they're like, I don't know, 9 months?
Right, yeah.
And I just had no idea what to do with myself. I'm like, but aren't we supposed to fix me?
Right, and with something like cancer, there is this sense that time is of the essence, but what essence it is.
But it's really a wait and see thing.
Right.
And the experience of time is of the essence. I wonder how much of that is from movies and yeah, like because they got to make that fit into one feature.
Right, and the reality is, as you know, people who work with cadavers all the time say, you know, most bodies have cancer in them, right? So it's which ones do we have to attend to?
Yeah.
I mean, to us, we have this fantasy of health and purity, and this kind of shame at talking about ourselves when we're ill.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things you and I have talked about is that kind of the way in which that sense of shame or silence about illness and the fragility of the body kind of makes you angry.
You don't, the thing that's like strange is like people want to hear about it, but especially like I found like when I had cancer, I made people uncomfortable, and I both was conscious of that and also thought this is bullshit.
Right.
Like I'm sorry that I make you uncomfortable, and you get a sense that everyone is hooked into the narrative because afterwards they asked, are you cured? I'm like, that's not how this works.
Right.
And it's the same with chronic illnesses. Like I have a lot of friends, and I've learned more about chronic illnesses because they've told me about it. And it's strange because we have this certain idea, even though I think as we're all getting older, and I don't know if it's the unhealthy lifestyle of comics. Like a lot of cartoonists I know have chronic diseases or serious problems, and so we should be able to talk about it without the fear of making people uncomfortable is not like, why?
Yeah, and for cartoonists, you guys are really on the front lines in terms of some of the most crucial, kind of scary debates of the moment in terms of health, because a lot of cartoonists, I won't attempt
we
to...
don't have insurance.
Yeah,
no.
I mean,
no, we're
I know very few cartoonists who have really solid insurance, right? So,
no.
So one of the things you've also been, particularly more recently, writing about and addressing, this is something that is a part of life for cartooning, is the need to reach out for help. And the shock this cartoon is, you know, a kind of, I think was really important to a lot of people circulating really recently in relation to the current debates. A kind of reminder, what was life pre-ACA like for artists, cartoonists, folks who were
it was
underinsured?
horrible, and my insurance that I was allowed to purchase after ACA passed was expensive.
Right.
I think when I was having the most, I dropped it down, but at first I had to go gold level because I needed so many.
Right.
And it was about $450 a month. And that's not including all the other things. And for me, I had a lot of money saved, so I used it all on this. But it's completely, before I didn't have insurance both because it was expensive, but because I have an anxiety disorder, they refused to sell me insurance pre-Obamacare. So I was not eligible for it because they said, well, you have an anxiety disorder, which means maybe you go to the hospital once, and that's a risk we don't want. And it's completely arbitrary, and if we go back to that, it will be, people will die, and it's weird for them to be so callous about it because it's a fact.
I know, and I, you know, this, I cannot help but think in terms of the arts, which, you know, is such a incredibly hard, brave life to begin with. Going back will mean we're going to just lose so many cartoonists in our world who are just going to be like, I can't do this anymore. I remember, I think it was in the documentary about John Porcellino that Dan Stafford made a while ago. Somebody in that documentary said, yeah, a lot of cartoonists, they get their first major illness and they're gone because they can't afford to keep doing this anymore.
No, I can understand that because there's a lot of upkeep, and like I have been working in illustration, so I had a lot saved. But I'll admit, like, and this is completely, I think it's bullshit. When I first got my diagnosis, part of my first fear was, how can I afford this?
Right.
And my first thing to
Which
do,
should not be the first thing you have to do.
one of the first things I did was tell the people I was working with what was happening, and I was very much afraid that they would fire me.
Right.
Because I'm just saying, I'm going to need to take this much time off for treatment. I'm a freelancer. If I can't do a project on a deadline, they were great. They were really supportive, and especially after the first surgery, I was just not, I had a lot of anesthesia, so for like 4 months I was completely zonked out. And they were really great, but I had to be nervous about it because they really could.
Right.
They really could have fired me. There's no reason, like, we're going to extend the deadline because, but they were very great about it.
At those moments you realize how utterly dependent the system makes you on precisely that. And I think your willingness to talk numbers even, like this is what it looks like.
Right. Yeah, and in fact, like this hospital I went to, one of the weird things, after my first surgery, I had a paralyzed vocal nerve, so I couldn't really talk, and I couldn't really breathe, and I was still messed up from medication. And someone from billing came to me hours after my surgery to say, we need to talk about like how you're going to pay for this. And I had to write on a piece of paper, like, I am full of painkillers and I cannot speak. I cannot do this right now. And within a couple of days of coming home, I was getting calls from billing, and I told them, like, I just had major surgery, and like...
You know that, that's why you're...
Yeah, and it's like literally, like I think this bill like came like really afterwards, and it was just like one of those things, like, what am I seeing? Like, how are you supposed to deal with both being ill, working, and paying the bill? And it's bullshit. So, like any bullshit thing, like someone being rude to you, like, I'll make a comic about it. Now who's laughing?
Yeah. the revenge of the cartoonist. Well, it is really important and great, not only that you talk about illness, but that you also talk about what illness means in America in our completely,
People in other countries are very shocked, and also healthy people or people who have always worked in jobs with insurance are also shocked too. I don't think they realize.
It's hard for them to wrap their minds around.
I think, it's sort of like it's sort of like if you go in a room and it's freezing cold, but you're like, but I'm okay, and everyone else is cold, and you're like, yes, but I'm okay. It's like, it doesn't change the fact that other people have other experiences.
Yeah, and I know that, we weren't going to talk too much about the politics of this moment, but of course, as we've talked about, healthcare is politics and increasingly crucial, and
it shouldn't be politics.
It shouldn't be politics. It should be a right. But you've also done some, I know it's been important for people in the community sharing their own struggles with how to balance daily life while wrestling with life since the election. And have you found that you've been able to kind of keep working, keep being creative?
I left the country.
So
there's that.
And you said we could all go with you, right?
I'm not even sure I get to stay. Like I just France is great. Please let me stay. But no, I don't know. I think everyone had the same. There was this exhaustion from the election, and for me, I was in France when I was watching the videos of the Nazi March. And it's really, I think everyone was already exhausted from the election. They're still exhausted now, and a lot of people, it's impossible not to comment on it in some way. And for me, I always have a lot of anxiety, and comments are the best way to describe it, but it is a really strange time. But at the same time, it's... At the same time, you also have to get groceries, as you put it. It's just, it's a strange thing. It's like, oh, the world is burning, the planet is dying, Nazis are really happy, I need coffee.
Right, no, it's
an absurd world.
Finding a way to bring that into your comics has been really terrific. I want to make sure I open things up for questions, because I'm hogging you as I tend to do. I just have to point to one last thing, though, which is, and I'm sorry I pixelated the last one there, JC, that's not fair there. I thought I had a better copy, but I love your gag comics, too. I love that you have this, and it comes with all your work, not just the ones that are, working with more traditional illustrated magazine or newspaper formats. Your sense of humor and timing just runs through all of your work, and your love of the gag. I know that you, in addition to old magician stuff, you also collect old humor magazines and things like that. But what is this kind of part of cartooning that we often, in this very serious age of alternative cartooning, we often like to distance ourselves from those degraded forms like superheroes and gag cartooning, but your embrace of that gag strikes me as really refreshing and exciting. What does the gag mean for you?
I love humor. I've put a lot of, probably way too much thought into it, about how there's something that is deeply human about creating narratives, but also no matter what has happened to someone, if it takes them 10 years and it was a horrible breakup, a horrible death, they're going to figure out a way to turn it into a funny story with a punchline. And I think there's something weird about humans that we understand that our experiences need to be stories, and preferably a story where people can laugh even though they understand the darkness of it.
Even if it's a tragic story.
And I love low jokes and I love high jokes, but I actually think there's something deeply profound about the fact that when we say we'll laugh about this someday, it's really true about most people I know that. And I don't know if it's a weird human reflex to try to make it something I lived through it and it didn't ruin me, so I can laugh about it, a little defiance.
And I think for me as a reader, that kind of, as somebody like you who's always had an ambivalent relationship to my body, let us say, laughing is one of the few times where I feel like everything's in sync when I'm laughing.
Oh yeah.
It all clicks. I mean, that's part of what I love about your work, is that even when you're dealing with loneliness or some really sad place, there's always the gesture to a punchline, even in some of your saddest comics, that kind of allows things to feel hopeful. And I just love that. Runs through all your work. I want to make sure we open it up for questions, but here I just got to show everybody a quick cameo.
This is my dog.
from some storyboarding work you did, where you got a cameo in there for...
Lisa Hannawald has drawn him into BoJack Horseman.
Oh, really?
And then
What's
I
his
think he's just in the background, but she told me it was him. And then so I'm just like, okay, so he's been on like 2 cartoons. I just need to get him into everything.
Yeah. You get him into Fuller House. That's really where.
Oh, like, yeah, just try to keep promoting it.
Yeah.
It's gonna just ride that way. But I told him, like, of course I'm gonna draw my dog into it because he's perfect.
Yeah, and he does have stalkers on the internet, like myself. And here's an example of some of your earliest work in music and a piece you did for Nico Case, right?
Yeah.
But I wanted to make sure we have some time for other people to jump in here. So any questions for the great Laura Park?
Did Asmata Kitty actually manage to sell some of your comics to their site? Or did
I think so, but I really took it as a gesture of like, really the label was just, it was founded by Sufjan Stevens and his stepfather, and they're really kind, generous people. So I think they just like the idea of like, well, we're selling stuff, well, you go ahead, put your stuff there too. I think 1 or 2, but not in any significant way, but it was very kind of them, so. And I hate to be I can't be the person who's in charge of distributing my work. I'm the bottleneck. So lately, Uncivilized Books, Tom Kay has been publishing my minis, which means they actually are in stores, because if it's me, it just, no. Like, you can buy it from me if I go to a comic convention, but other than that, like, it's not medicine, you don't need it. I don't need to, like, but again, like, it's just part of the job. Like, I have friends who love packaging up orders. I hate this. So I'm not a good source to distribute my own work.
That's a lot of burden. You guys have to do it all. I mean, that's, or not. You don't have to.
No, you have to find things like, for me, I don't like mailing out stuff, and I don't like promoting myself. So you just have to find the person who says good things about you, so you don't have to do it. And I really believe, like, if you do comics or some sort of art, like, do not make it the job you paid. Like, there's already so many difficult things about it. Like, there's no need.
Absolutely, it's great advice. Any other questions?
Hi, I was so impressed that you had Thomas Nast up on your wall.
Oh,
That's the coolest thing.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, so Jared and I are actually working on an exhibit right now of cartoons about immigration.
Oh.
And we're having, some challenges with how do you present some of these, like Thomas Nast, who, has some stereotypes and is very negative stereotypes.
He's got all the stereotypes.
All the stereotypes.
Yeah. Too many of those old 19th century cartoons.
Yeah.
But
How do you present that, where you're like, well, not everyone was people at some point?
I mean, it really is tough, and obviously we want people to appreciate the work, but at the same time, it is can be offensive. So I was just curious if you had any thoughts about that as you look back.
Yeah, can you solve this problem for us?
Like for me, this is sort of related to, I guess, like it's not really political correctness, but I respect anyone's right to be uncomfortable with anything. For me, like for instance, I love Frank King and I love Gasoline Alley. Do I feel super comfortable? Like there's the character who's just straight up blackface in the comic, and yes, she's more human, but yes, she totally conforms to that. And so for me, I'm not super thrilled about it, but if you read that and said, deal breaker, I don't want to read this, that's your choice. So I think it's important to give context. I think, JC, there's a Tintin book in the Congo, and I think some people have said, like, it's just like, this is colonialist and this is racist, and I think they added a new note to the edition to explain a bit the time. So I think that's the best you can do, to say, we're better now, but also acknowledge that, like, this is a loaded image. And Thomas Nast, I mean, like, it's strange for me as a modern American to see, like, man, people hated the Irish.
I know.
Like, just really hated them.
Especially Nast. He had some personal issues going on.
Yeah, but like because of the famine, like I think it was something like you can have 100,000 Irish people arriving in New York in one day.
Right, and
So,
he was growing up in the middle of that.
and they were
was-
Catholics.
Right,
But
which was rudiment for
there
him.
was, I think Caitlin would probably know, there was that Kepler, was a Kepler illustration of like all the immigrants pointing at each other and then they showing the streams of immigrants. So there was Italian, Polish, Irish, and it's hard. I think you just have to leave it open. You don't have to damn the artwork,
Right.
but you have to leave it open if this is a deal breaker for some people.
Yeah, and kind of let people, also point to the fact that some of these attitudes, while they've been muted in some ways, can be found in comics today. I mean, in our pop culture today. It's not like that's entirely in the past by any means, as we.
No, I don't think you
as
can
we've seen.
sanitize it. And
Right.
for me, like, for instance, like, there's always like you find out more facts about people, and sometimes you're like, I can't watch this guy's movies anymore. But you're okay, like, I can't watch Woody Allen movies anymore. For me, I don't know, I'm out. But I watch all the Hitchcock movies, and you're never going to hear a great story about him with women.
No.
And
No.
it's not, but it's...
I tried to find one, they don't exist.
No, and so you just have to kind of, I think, you have to provide people the information, you're not hiding it. And for the
And
early
let them make their own
cartoons,
choices.
they can be really not progressive.
No.
They're of the time, but that's kind of like excusing like old racist grandma, like she's old. Like it's
Right.
not really a sophiscient band-aid to just go
No,
like it's
especially
old.
when you have contemporaries like Kepler, who could be much more, as an immigrant himself, much
Yeah.
more nuanced and sophisticated about these same issues. Nask was also, came from immigrant background, so there's no excuse or justification. And yet,
I just hated the Irish.
he really hated the Irish. And yet there were we even found some cartoons by him where he seemed to briefly forget he hated the Irish. So, a reminder that human beings are fallible and schizophrenic too.
Maybe it might be just he liked the way of drawing that
There is
which
a
I've
little-
never seen an Irish person who looks the way that we used to draw them.
Yeah, no, it's, that's, the stereotype for those who haven't seen it was a very,
It's like the Notre Dame mascot, which is weird.
yeah, it was a kind of like
Bulldog?
a kind of bulldog, a kind of simian bulldog.
Yes.
Really, really offensive stuff. And if you want to see all of these really offensive
Yeah.
open in the yeah, that was a plug. You got in the plug. So you're here for the residency.
Yes.
And you'll be with us for a couple of weeks. And you'll be at CXC. You have a couple of events at CXC, I think.
Well, I'll be tabling with JC.
Awesome.
JC will be doing a panel discussion with Gary Groff. I'll be working with some students.
Awesome.
And I'll just be working on also my own projects in this very nice house that
Yay.
I've been given, and trying to soak up all. I just got to explore the museum a bit yesterday, and I'm eager to exploit the Billy Ireland as much as possible. So very, very happy.
We like to be exploited, especially by people who love this stuff as much as you do, and who have found ways of making comics so exciting and keeping me looking forward to everything you're going to be doing next. So let's use this as an occasion to thank Laura Park, and make sure you come see her show downstairs.